Hello, this is S.K. Williams, and today I have machines running in the background. The reason for this is because it is Labor Day, the first ever socialist holiday. And it is an ironic holiday, because holiday is actually a shortening and corruption, not in the bad way, just in the way we slur words together, of the word holy day. Of course, in the past, this wouldn't be so odd, but in today's world, we talk about people being non-religious, and even things like governments being non-religious and secularism being the opposite of religion. In reality, secularism is a religion. And a lot of the social movements are religions. Which is ironic, because the very people who would insist that this not be so, especially within the self-declared skeptic community, the ones who pride themselves on critical thinking and reason, will both say I'm wrong and then agree with me on other points, so long as it suits their own narrative and their own purposes. For example, the divine prophet, Sam Harris Most Holy, hallowed be his name, hallowed be the name of science, hallowed be the name of reason, hallowed be the name of no God, hallowed be the name of Sam Harris, claims that communism and a certain other ism, whose name would get me stricken from the record here, since gaggle enjoys gagging people. But it was led by Charlie Chaplin. If you ever watched the movie The Dictator, it was led by him. It's talking about that movie. Though I think if you have a modicum of intelligence, you know what I'm really talking about. Charlie Chaplinism. I suppose I could also say Mo Howard from the Three Stooges. The Stooges did a short on this, but I can't really name that short since it sounds too close to the real thing as well. So I'm going to continue to use Charlie Chaplin. Having said all that, the divine prophet, Sam Harris Most Holy, wants to put to rest that anyone is ever killed for secularism by conflating it with atheism and saying no one has killed in the name of atheism. And he does so by claiming that communism and the other ism led by Charlie Chaplin were actually forms of religion, or at the very least operated like religion without otherworldly concern, so they were not true secularism. This is, of course, a no true Scotsman fallacy, and ultimately makes his position unfalsifiable. That's because the divine prophet, Sam Harris Most Holy, has just created a situation to where secular governments are only determined to truly be secular if they do not engage in authoritarianism, oppression, and the ending of many people to unalive them in large numbers. This is, of course, nonsensical and silly. After all, it's ultimately circular reasoning. What the divine prophet, Sam Harris Most Holy, is decreeing as divine and sacred words of science, reason, and no God, is that should a secular society begin to show authoritarian and oppressive tendencies, or to begin to unalive people unjustly, especially if they unalive them in large, massive numbers, that well, that means that it is no longer true secularism. It is religion, or at the very least functions like religion with religious thinking. But by that same token, it would be literally impossible to ever find fault with secularism or a secular society, because the moment you do, it becomes not secular. It's one of the problems that I have overall with modern-day atheist arguments. But why am I talking about atheism? Nobody is about socialism. Well, unfortunately, the modern-day atheist movement is all about socialism. Now, do keep in mind, I already know there were Christian socialists, and people can be religious and be socialist. My argument is not that all atheists are socialists. My argument is not that you can't be religious and be socialist. My argument isn't even that you can't be Christian and be socialist, at least in the way most people of the world would talk about it, which basically reduces Christianity to anyone who claims to be Christian, and then, of course, lumps all Christians together in one big pot based upon the most negative traits, or whatever trait happens to help the argument at the moment. That is why, as a Christian, I am guilty of Adolf Hitler, otherwise known as Charlie Chaplin, because he was a devout Catholic, and his anti-Elvinism came from centuries of Catholic anti-Elvinism and teaching the elves were the killers of Jesus, and the movement he led considered itself Christian. It was a Christian movement. The Catholic followers of Charlie Chaplin. This is, of course, all nonsense if you actually read the history of it. A history I intend to go into on the other platform, the one you have to bite and chew, otherwise known as the shoot of bit, where I can actually speak like a normal person. But I have promised myself I should finish my Trinity video before releasing more on that, and I have yet to complete my video on the Holy Trinity. But my actual argument is not so much that if you give up on religion and become an atheist, you will be a socialist. Indeed, I'm often accused of calling atheism a religion simply because I don't think of atheism as the opposite of religion. To most people, it's either or. Either atheism is a religion, or else atheists are not religious. And since atheism is not a religion, atheism is a lack of belief in a god, atheism is a religion like bald is a hair color, then I'm stupid if I say atheists are religious, since atheism is not a religion. Of course, what I just quoted also came from the divine prophet Sam Harris, most holy, hallowed be his name. And it is part of his sacred scriptures in the End of Faith. But it's also a contradiction, since he goes on then to call atheists religious if they follow communism. And some try to justify this, of course, by saying communism actually has a god. They worship the state as a god. And this is one of the problems that I keep running into with modern-day atheists, or modern-day people in general. They don't seem to understand what communism is as a theory. The communists are imagined as statists who believed in the government and statism, when in reality communism is a form of anarchism. It is about the rejection of statism. And while it would be perfectly valid to point out that in practice communist countries never attain the level to which the state has its power eroded and simply does set up authoritarian governments, the point being made here is, ideologically, within the mind of a communist, you are not looking at the state as all, looking at yourself as a servant of the state, and thinking that the state must be preserved. So the idea that the communists are worshipping the state as a god is nonsense. What they actually do contradicts their ideology although it would be argued that it only contradicts part of it. In reality, the Marxist ideology they're following, or more properly, Marxist-Leninism, or Marxist-Leninist Maoism, virtually guarantee this outcome, because they don't really contradict the ideological foundations. It only contradicts the way the ideology understands itself, much like the modern atheist ideology defines atheism as a mere lack of belief in a God, and from there comes up with a lot of conclusions that sound reasonable if atheism were a lack of belief in a God, but actually contradicts reality because they don't understand atheism as a lack of belief in a God. It's basically the same problem. After all, I've actually had atheists tell me that atheists are more politically diverse than religious people, because atheism is not an ideology, so atheists can fall anywhere on the political spectrum and it not contradict atheism, as it's just a lack of belief. And that's why you see atheists both on the political right and left in roughly equal numbers, whilst religious people are overwhelmingly conservative, and that's because they follow religious books, and those religious books teach conservative values and prevent you from changing and being liberal. And of course, conservatism means keeping things the way they are, and religion is static, so religious people tend to be conservative, and only moderates who reject parts of their religion can even go the other way. But the overwhelming majority of religious people are conservative because they are religious, whilst atheists are much more diverse. And of course, this isn't true if you look at the actual statistics. In reality, atheists tend in the modern Western world to be less politically diverse than the religious people. And I am using the terminology of our world. Our world does generally see atheists as the opposite of the religious. And the reason is because atheism is not just not being religious. Atheism is not a lack of a religion. Atheism is not a lack of belief in a God. In reality, atheism is a belief there is no God. But in practice, people who say, I am an atheist in the modern world, actually mean, I listen to people like Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins, or at least used to, until he went a nutter and started saying Christianity was good. I listen to Christopher Hitchens. I support atheist organizations like the National Secular Society in the UK, or the American Humanist Association, or the Freedom from Religion Foundation, or the Center for Inquiry, things like that. And they all listen to the same atheist video channels, they read the same atheist blogs. There's an organized movement around it, and their understanding of what it means to be an atheist is very clearly based upon an ideological understanding of the world, which includes philosophical concepts such as philosophical naturalism, materialism, and it's actually a dialectic of materialism. They don't like admitting that because it gives the game away. But the modern day atheist movement is very much based upon the concept of struggle, and about existence being a struggle between conflicting points. You can see this within the mythology that science and religion are at war with each other, with science being about reason and truth, and religion being about faith and shutting your brain off and just believing. And these two great forces are believing in myths and fairy tales versus believing in reason, about not thinking for yourself and believing only blindly in authority and being a rationalist and free thinker. These two forces are at odds and at war. Well, this narrative, which was first introduced in the 19th century by Andrew Dickerson White and by John Draper, was actually inspired by Marxist concepts, because Marxism is very much based upon the dialectic. In fact, Charlie Chaplin's book, This Struggle of Mine, if you know what the euphemism means, was itself based upon the dialectic of materialism, because the entire principle of Marxist thinking is about struggle and conflict, and about the Hegelian idea of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, with Marx understanding all of history being a struggle between classes of haves and have-nots, about the controllers who control resources, and the laborers who labor for their master's benefit, who get little to nothing from the labor until they become frustrated, overthrow their lords, and become the lords themselves, and once in power, they become corrupt, and of course begin oppressing others, thus creating a vicious cycle until one day you can meet in the middle and have a synthesis to where there are no laborers being oppressed and there are no lords over them to oppress them. A center ground of equality. That is the entire basis of Marxist thinking. And Marxism never quite stated that this had ever been attained. It had not been. When Marx was alive, he said it must be attained. That is what he meant by there is a spectre haunting Europe, and that spectre is communism. He was talking about this new movement that would be the final revolution of the world, bringing about true stability, true justice, true peace, by abolishing the class system altogether, thus abolishing all conflict, since all conflict is economic in nature. And by economic, he didn't just mean money, he was talking about resources. All conflict is over resources, and who has the right to control them. And since if we had lived in a world of equality where all things are shared, we would have no reason to fight. That is the basis of communism. And that is the origin of the labor movement in general, which, to be fair, did begin prior to Marx. Marx drew a lot of his ideas from previous people like Robert Owen, but it is the general concepts that went into Marxism, or that Marx himself introduced or expanded upon, that led to the modern-day atheist movement, because the modern-day atheist movement is not new. It's not even, a lot of people would say that too, but they would say, well, the arguments aren't new, but the new atheism did bring up the sheer, absolute contempt for religion and religious people. Atheists didn't used to be like that. Well, they actually did used to be like that. They used to be like that in the 19th century. And it really does seem that it's part of the concept that you've heard before, that the brighter the image, the darker the negative. And of course this is difficult to understand today because I would have to talk about the British Empire, and the British Empire is seen as evil both by people on the left and the right, especially in America. We know that monarchy is evil, and many people even class monarchism as a left-wing ideology for some reason nowadays in America, thanks to Cleon Skousen in his book, which was popularized by one Glenn Beck. Regrettably, this actually damages the ability people have to understand the real situation in the same way that modern-day leftism and wokeism do, and in the same way that the new atheist mythology does. But this shouldn't be too surprised. The woke movement came from this self-declared skeptic community. There would be no woke movement today if not for the new atheism. But there would be no new atheism if not for wealthy donors and backers who promoted these ideas. And there would be no new atheism if not for the 19th century labor movement. The 19th century labor movement gave rise to the criticism of religion, and this is why they will speak the way they do. In the 19th century, Christianity was so ubiquitous that people would talk about religion and they would just mean Christianity. And the same is true today. The modern-day atheists have to use an excuse by saying, I hate all religions equally, I just talk about Christianity because it's the most popular religion where I live, and it's not really true. If you actually read the old books from the 19th century, you see the same arguments being made. But the reason they're making the arguments the way they are is because they are largely just critical of Christianity as well. But they are attacking the state religion because they are largely coming from England. England and Britain in general were deeply Christian in the 19th and early 20th century. So deeply so that it really makes it odd when they talk about Charlie Chaplin being a devout Catholic, and it's showing that it was Christians who were killing the elves. They seem to forget that. They act like Britain was this secular utopia, and so was America. The Soviet Union was. It was atheist, but the other two were not. But at the same time, the labor movement was largely predicated less on simply giving rights to the laborer and more on the idea that the Enlightenment, which stalled and failed after the French Revolution, needed to be revived and continued. And of course, with any revival movement of this sort, they began reinterpreting the past along present lines, both in terms of incorporating the then modern ideas of the world that had changed some since the 18th century. It had been about 50 years. But that also started adding new novel ideas that people were talking about. But nevertheless, the Enlightenment did give the rise to some of the philosophical ideas that they went into, that were revived and modified and expanded upon. And it also contributed to the ideas mythology, because ultimately, even if they prefer to say they are not religious today, they follow a religion, and the Enlightenment is seen as this glorious time when science and reason broke the back of religion and freed man from the tyranny of monarchy and religion and gave us a world of science and reason. And of course, religion and monarchy gave us oppression, tyranny, and violence, but the Enlightenment gave us peace and reason and truth and tolerance, which is an odd way of thinking about it, because the Enlightenment was a time of violent, bloody revolution, and you have people like Steven Pinker coming along talking about how the world is becoming less violent, and how we need a new Enlightenment to make it even less violent. Well, the Enlightenment was violent, and even people who try and justify it by saying, yes, it was violent, but not as violent as the Christian era before it, with all the Crusades and Inquisition, which is, of course, not true. Christianity was actually less violent than the Enlightenment. And even the things they talk about as inexcusable evils, like the Crusades and Inquisition, were far less violent than they depict them as, and far less violent than the revolutionaries, which is generally what we see in the modern world as well. But the problem that I have with it is that it isn't just about the rights of labor, just like the atheist movement is not just about lacking belief in a God due to insufficient evidence. There's this mythology behind it, and there's this philosophical understanding of the world behind it. And the actual goal of the labor movement was not so much just to give rights to laborers. There were plenty in the labor movement that just wanted that, but the actual goal was to have a worldwide revolution that overthrew the capitalistic system, the imperialistic system. And this is why they talk about imperialism even to this day. It's because back then there was the British Empire, which is what they were primarily fighting more than the United States. And to overthrow the old restraints of power and authority. And they definitely presented it as a class struggle, with the labor being understood as a labor class, not as something you do. It's not like someone doing work is labor. Labor is talking about the people who are in a social class who are expected to fill certain jobs, like factory work, or like manual labor of other sorts, like like working as a machinist in a machine shop, or working as a repairman, or even working as a farmhand or something. The idea back then was that labor was this class of people, because it largely emerged from Britain, where they actually do have classes and noble titles. And in the 19th century, while this was already declining even before the Enlightenment and even before the 19th century, they still had sway in it. Certain people born of certain families of the gentry or the nobility were expected to take certain positions, to go to certain universities, and to leave those universities, going into yet more positions that would be seen as the leaders of men, the social class that governed society, that told society what it would do and which direction it would go. And while occasionally some skilled or lucky man, or perhaps a combination of both, would rise out of one of the lower classes and be given access to this higher status, for the most part, a small group of families were largely seen as in charge, and the mythos about how awful that was grew out. It really wasn't as awful as they said in terms of how people actually lived. They were not being slaughtered in the street indiscriminately by lords, as the Enlightenment propaganda would say. But this is the way they presented it. Labour was talking about the class of people, and their goal was to, as had happened so many times in history, rise up and overthrow their oppressors, but with one main difference. The goal was not to then become oppressors themselves, but to eradicate class distinctions altogether, and to create a society of equals where there's no class and where everyone is the same and everyone owns the same things. There would be no private property, there would be no private ownerships of factories or the means of production, and there was some disagreement in exactly how far to take this. Some of them were perfectly willing to allow private property in terms of private use for property, like a house to live in. But you couldn't own the means of production, which would include a farm, because the farm has to feed the people and therefore has to belong to the people and not an individual person. So even though some of them would allow you to own a house to live in because, well, you need a personal space to live, they wouldn't allow you to have the means to produce the food that you would need. That has to belong to everyone. And the same thing would belong to factories and what have you. And like I said, there are actually degrees of this. Some actually would be okay with small private farmers or small businesses and stores. It really depends on which one you read. But they all have in common this idea of collectivization and of an elimination of a class system. So that in the end we would have no rulers, no masters, no one over us, no political class. And even though the final goal of communism was actually the complete abolition of government altogether, as people govern themselves in a classless state where they share all things. Because again, the understanding that is brought to this, especially by Marx and Marxist theory, is that all warfare and all struggle is ultimately based on material concerns, the access to goods and services. This is part of the dialectic of materialism. Marx understood it actually as a universal principle, that our existence is nothing but matter in motion, and that all the things we see, from the changes to transformations of nature, all occur by forces of nature acting in conflict with each other, thus producing storms or producing elements through violent changes. And the goal of communism was to seize control of nature, which is why it's odd that the modern left is so environmentalist, because previously it was the right wing that was environmentalist. It was the right wing that wanted to preserve nature and beauty. This is why you have people like Tolkien talking about the Shire. And if you read Christian works from the 19th century, they bemoan the creation of factories that ripped apart ancient forests. Today we think of the right wing being all about corporations and industry, and the left being environmentalist. But it was very, very different in the 19th century. It was the opposite in that regard. But the ultimate goal was to seize control of nature and to use its bounties to benefit all equally by giving access to all the way in which we control it, and to end the dialectic by creating a total equality of forces, which may not be attainable in nature, admittedly, but which could be attained in society once everyone owned everything equally, and once society had been reacclimated into accepting this, because Marx, Engels, and others of this ilk were following Rousseau's idea of a blank slate. So the assumption of this class distinction that they were using was not that it was some innate aspect of human nature, but that it was culturally created and could be uncreated. So the entire principle that they pushed for was a creation of equality by creating equality of outcomes and equality of access to goods, and the abolition of any distinctions between persons, which is why modern-day neo-Marxists, which we call woke, tend to push for transgenderism and tend to push for the gay rights movement. It's a way of destroying classical traditional morality, which is seen as binding and confining to people and creating distinctions. They want the total freedom that comes with anarchy. But communists do not worship the state as a god. They work toward the abolition of the state. But this would come in stages. In Marxist theory, Marx believed that first you would overthrow the old order, much as feudalism was overthrown by the creation of the modern nation-state, and that was overthrown by the capitalist and industrial class. The industrial class would be overthrown by labor, but labor would simply not create a new oppressive class, and that we could create a dictatorship of the proletariat, which is a governmental system, much like the previous ones, with one exception. It would make everyone labor. Everyone would be the same. There would be no noble titles. There would be no privileged positions. There would be no leaders. And this would be imposed by the state. The people working for the state are working toward the ideals of equality and are themselves but ministers serving the people and serving the greater good of humanity in the future by imposing social changes until humanity had become acclimated to it, and it became natural for them. And at that point, the dictatorship of the proletariat would dissolve on its own, being no longer needed. Of course, that later stage was never attained by any nation that embraced Marxist thinking. But this is the thinking behind Marxism, and that is why we have Labor Day. It is a celebration of labor as a class, not the labor that people do. And that's one of the odd things about the old joke. Labor Day, it's called Labor Day, but we don't work, so why is it called Labor Day if we don't labor? It's because you're celebrating labor itself. But it's a holiday that I find rather problematic. Not because I think the common man need not be celebrated, but because the connotations with it, and the very fact that it's called Labor Day, would indicate that it does have socialist and even Marxist roots, and is celebrating more than just the working man, but the concept of labor as a class as understood within Marxist thinking. Having said all that, today is also a holy day of obligation. It is a feast day within the traditional Catholic calendar. By the way, I know I'm getting some things wrong, but welcome to the modern Tube of You Sinter ship. Today is St. Stephen, the King of Hungary's feast day within the traditional Catholic calendar. So we can honor St. Stephen, ironically, a king, today as well. Having said all that, this concludes my special Labor Day video. I sincerely and truly hope you enjoyed it, although it would be difficult considering how oddly I talk now, but do keep in mind I'm having trouble with the Tube of You striking videos, so I'm having to speak in a very unusual way these days. But nevertheless, I shall take my leave of you. Thank you, God bless, and goodbye.